Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here with you all. Like she said, I get to work at Adventist Health Castle. I've always kind of been fascinated by grief because I think everyone experiences it somehow. And I know I've been through versions of grief, whether it be I move somewhere, or I lose a pet, or I lose a loved one, or maybe my career changes, whatever it may be. Grief is really huge. Grief is really complicated. And I think it's always an incredible journey to go on with people and navigate life with. So honored to be here with you all. I do love grief jokes, which is probably a very morbid thing to appreciate. But I also help run the Bereavement Network of Hawaii, and often we'll be sending each other grief jokes because I think most of us really just want to laugh, right? In the midst of everything, we want that disruption. We want to be able to smile. We want to be able to experience things. So thank you for having me here with you. We'll go ahead and get started. So the conversation is coping with grief. I will not claim to be perfect at this. This is an ongoing journey, and I think all of us have our own ways to do it. But here's some of the things that I found really interesting as I've journeyed along. And this is somewhat watered down and complex at the same time. So whatever level you want to go into that level with me, and we'll just keep moving forward. So what is grief? Grief is a natural reaction to loss of what is important to an individual. So this is where I was saying a little bit earlier, grief could be in anything, right? It could be a career change, a loss of a partner, a loss of a friendship. It could be you had to sell your favorite apartment because you had to start growing up and get a bigger house, right? It may be any variation. Sometimes grief can even be in good situations, but it is anything that is important to you that you have lost. Grief is a strong, sometimes overwhelming emotion for people, regardless of whether their sadness stems from the loss of a loved one or from a terminal diagnosis they or someone they know have received. Now, I want to pause here a little bit because I do think what's really interesting is that grief can also be secondary. Have you ever heard a really sad story and you feel every piece of it, and then you relate to it, and suddenly you're back where you were, right? So grief can be secondary. It could be in third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh level from you, but there's always things that connect us because that's one of the beautiful parts of humanity, right? And there's actually something in our brains called mirror neurons, and that's why a lot of us actually have empathy, because it sees you going through the thing that other people go through. Right? You're mirroring it. So like when you're walking down the hall and you wave at someone and someone waves back at you, that's an immediate response, right? If a little kid starts like dancing in front of you at a restaurant, most of us somehow start moving with the kid, right? Not because we're thinking this is a cool dance move. It's more because you can't help it. If you're not overthinking life, you start mirroring people. You start feeling the things they feel. You start going on that journey alongside them. So how do we cope with grief? I kind of brain dumped a couple of different things. And so here I touch on self-care. Part of self-care is acknowledging your grief. What are you navigating? It's not the same thing as other people's navigating. My brother and I just lost our mom a couple years ago, and how he's processing it and how I process it, totally different. Is one of them right or wrong? No. It's who we are as different people. We're navigating it differently. So how do I acknowledge my grief? How do I take care of myself? How do I celebrate the small steps and find ways to laugh? How do I go to therapy or join a support group that works for me? And then, of course, educate yourself on the difference between grief and depression, because I think grief and depression can be mistaken for each other, right? And so learning which one you're focusing on as you navigate can be really helpful. And then we talk about time. Allow time to be healing. I think people think that there's a timeline for grief. And I'll be honest, it could be some people feel good in a couple weeks, and then in 3 years it hits them. Some people feel it for 15 years. Some people feel it for a lifetime. Some people don't want to feel it, right? And so time is really powerful, but also being aware that time can be healing, and allow yourself to go on whatever journey of time that is for you. It doesn't need to match up with anyone else. Give yourself space to simply be. I think often we think that we need to be something for someone at some point, and sometimes we just need to simply be. One of my friends actually talked about the revolutionary act of realizing the power of being. And it's not some entity necessarily, it's how do you sit present in the moment you're in and allow yourself to feel what you want to feel, not what other people think you should feel. And then this one I kind of touched on ahead, but try not to focus on expected timelines. I think this is especially hard for people that have lost their partner, especially if you have children, because kids have a different timeline because they're navigating it differently than the parent, right? And the parent is going through the day in, day out routine of loss, where the kid is going in loss of a parent, right? And so there's just different timelines. And I've heard over and over and over again, like, shouldn't you be feeling better? Shouldn't this be, you should be past this phase already? And that comes in really heavy and hard for people, right? So being aware that there is no actual expected timeline, they've been studying this for years and years, and there isn't a perfect timeline. Empathy. So how do we cope with grief and have empathy? Allow empathy for yourself and for others. I'm going to show you in a couple minutes a video that has really helped me define what empathy is in my life. But empathy can be complex. It is very different than sympathy. It is more connected and in depth. A reminder that your grief journey is absolutely unique. This goes back to the timeline is your timeline, and your grief journey is your grief journey. There are no two grief journeys alike, right? And so we feel different things. We get triggered by different things. You may be in the grocery store and you may see some detergent that you haven't seen in 10 years, and that might be the thing that triggers you. And then you have to leave the grocery store falling apart. And that makes sense to nobody, right? But for you, you're like, oh my word, we used to buy this detergent, and that one time he knocked it off the washer, it spilled everywhere, it got behind everything, and the washer started short circuiting, and you have this whole backstory for why that detergent's important, right? But for other people, it's just detergent, right? So realizing that your grief journey is your grief journey, and things will affect you in different ways. Allow people to help, even with some easy tasks. I don't know about you all, but sometimes it's hard for me to ask for help. And when people say, like, let me know how I can help you, it's like, I don't even know how to help myself, right? And so that piece of like, how do we allow people to enter into our space? And sometimes the best way to do that is to give small tasks like, hey, can you help me take out the rubbish? Or it would be really awesome if I just had company while I went grocery shopping. Those are little things that help people be part of your life without it being a complicated big lift, right? So allowing people to help, especially your closer community, even with some really minuscule, easy tasks. And then the power of community. Conversations with family and friends. I think there is a power in talking about people. I'm specifically referring to people, but also memories of places that you used to live, or animals you used to have, or friendships that you used to have. There's something about reminiscing that can be really healing. The power is reminding yourself of the beauty that was and somehow bringing it into the future, but not letting it paralyze you, right? So there's a fine line between reminiscing and paralysis. Right? Often we look back on our past and we're like, oh, those were the best days of my life, or that was the best time, or blah, 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 whatever it may be, right? And reminding yourself there's a power in community and friends and reminiscing, but how do we take that and keep moving forward and using that as energy rather than things that tie us down? Join in on things where you feel comfortable. Comfort is an interesting thing, but sometimes it's nice to be part of things, whether it be you join a book club or a running club or a canoe club or whatever it may be, or maybe you just join a small group and have conversations with people, right? So how do you continue to grow as a person, even in the midst of grief? Allow nature and people to be healing. I think sometimes, again, we paralyze ourselves and we either stick ourselves inside or can't go back home. So finding ways to allow the spaces that we interact with to be healing versus paralyzing. Find things to be part of that remind you of hope. Sometimes, as you can see right below, faith, tradition, and belief can be really powerful. And I'm not necessarily saying religion. I'm saying, what are the things that ground you? Is it a good hike? Is it dunking your head in the ocean? Is it hanging out with your grandkids? Is it watching I Love Lucy? Is it watching Seinfeld? What is it that brings you hope, makes you laugh, kind of disrupts that intense layer of life, right? And I think that's what can be really, that's a superpower in my opinion, is when you're stuck in a rut and you can find a way to disrupt it so you can get out of it, right? While not ignoring what you're going through. So empathy versus sympathy. I'm going to do a quick thing where I'm going to go and show you a video. How many of you guys have ever heard of Brené Brown? I love Brené Brown because she is the ultimate observer of people. I love that she has an awareness of how people interact and she has an insight and a clarity in communicating it. So actually at the hospital, I show this video at orientation for every new hire. And part of it is to be aware of the difference between empathy and sympathy. For me, I try to remind people that for years, I was taught that sympathy is pretty much the right way to handle everything, right? You send a sympathy card, so sorry for your loss, right? You drop off a casserole, thinking of you, right? And that's really beautiful. And there's a lot of really good stuff in sympathy. But then I found out that I thought I was being empathetic, but really it was sympathetic, right? And there's nothing wrong with sympathy, but sympathy is, hey, you over there, sorry for your loss. Where empathy is, I'm here with you as we navigate this loss. Does that make sense? So I'm going to play a video that hopefully will explain this a little bit better than me. So please bear with me.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So I've really always appreciated this video because I think for me, it clarifies the disconnect between sympathy and empathy. Again, I want to be clear because sympathy kind of gets a bad name in this. But if you think about it, when you're having a really bad day and someone says, at least, it shuts down all of your emotions, right? And you're like, whatever, I'm not even finish this conversation, right? Because it's hard to want to finish a conversation when someone is working so hard to find the silver lining that they're not actually listening to you. And I'll be honest that there's been so many times where I'm more of an optimistic person. So I'm like, yeah, let's find something good and let's move forward and like get this energy going, right? And I wonder how many times I've shut people down. And I think about it. One time I was with a gentleman who had just been diagnosed with cancer. He came in for routine blood work and he got some really bad news on his way home. He had to come back and he was going through the grieving process of how do I tell work? How do I tell my wife? How do I tell kids? What's going to happen? And I was in there just listening. I was a baby chaplain, like 21. And this nurse walked in and she said, at least it's the best kind of cancer you can get. Does that change that he needs to figure out how to talk to his wife, his kids, his work? What's this going to look like? What kind of procedures are going to happen? All these unknowns? No. Is that true? Yeah. But is that what we want to hear when we're trying to process all this? Probably not. And so being aware of how we use our words and how we project on people and how we support people can be really powerful. And that's why for me, I think I was raised and I'm naturally empathetic because I think we all are, but I think I was trained the social norms of sympathy, right? There's a slight disconnect. Empathy is you step into that space and sometimes you have no idea what to say. And I think that's the beautiful part where it ends. It says it's more important about the connection than the words, right? And we can probably say that about our best friends, about the people we look to the most. It's how they showed up in the tough times that really made them your person, right? And so being aware of that empathy versus sympathy, whether you're grieving and someone says something ridiculous to you, or whether someone else is grieving and you're navigating how to support them. So Kubler-Ross model has been used a lot, so I figured I couldn't not mention it. This is a modified version of it. I will say that there's many more dynamics than just this model, okay? But this has been the one that most people look at. The other thing I will say is that this is not in an order. A lot of people think that you go through these specific orders and then that's how you're supposed to grieve. But the reality is you could start with one, go back to another one, go over here, skip 4. It doesn't matter, right? Grief is all over the map. But I thought we would touch on this. So shock was one that was added. Initial paralysis at hearing the bad news. What just happened, right? So this often happens in an accident or whether it be something that just takes you by complete surprise, or maybe it's a global situation. Probably most of us hit pretty big shock when COVID started coming out more and more, right? And we were all like, what is happening? What is true? What is weird? How is this going to affect me? How is this going to affect my loved one, wherever they may be? So what just happened? Denial, trying to avoid the inevitable. And you say to yourself, this can't be happening to me. This isn't my life. This isn't the thing I'm supposed to be experiencing. Anger, I think a lot of us have this more than we want to admit, right? You're frustrated and you start outpouring all that bottled up emotion, right? So the thing that kind of makes you snap or bubble over. Why is this happening to me? Who can I blame for this? This happens a lot in the hospital when things don't go the way that we think it should go. And we feel those emotions rightfully because things happen that shouldn't have happened. And it may not even be anyone's fault, right? But it bottles up and you get to the point where you're like, why is this happening to me? And who can I point the finger at? Because I need to offload my anger somewhere, right? Bargaining, seeking in vain for a way out. Make this not happen. And in return, I will, right? So often we find this with religion, right? We barter with God and we say, if you do this, I will forever be great. Or if I do this really well, then I will forever tell people I love them every time I hang up the phone. Whatever it may be, you start bargaining and bartering with your existence and with your rhythm of life. Depression, final realization of the inevitable. I'm too sad to do anything. I give up. I'm just going to sit here and be sad. That's a very real part of existence as well. Testing, this is another one that was added. Seeking realistic solutions. So what does this really mean and what are the bounds, right? We do this all the time. So what are you really saying? And how far can I push it? How far does reality go? How can I manipulate the situation? So you start testing the bounds of reality. And then acceptance. You finally find the way forward. I'm at peace with what happened. So one of the things I want to pause here is acceptance, I think, happens interspersed between the whole thing. Because some days you're angry and the next you're like, okay, this is my reality. And then the next day you're depressed and then you accept, okay, this is my reality. and you kind of ping pong all around. And that's why I want to be clear. A lot of people look at this Kubler-Ross model and they think, oh, this is the order. I need to be overwhelmed, and then I need to do this, and then I need to do this, and then eventually I get to acceptance and I move on with my life. If you do that, you're my superhero and I'm in awe of you, because I don't think I've met anyone that has successfully gone through the stages in order in a timeline and nailed it and gotten to acceptance and been like, yep, I'm good. I never need to reflect on that again, right? Grief is all over the map. It is chaos and color and magic and beauty all in a bundle. And it makes you feel insane sometimes. And then it also makes you realize that you are one of the most blessed people in the world because you found love. Right. And so it's finding that balance on how you move through it. I like to remind people that there's a slight difference between self-care and coping. And we'll get to that in a second. But one of the things that I think is really powerful is realizing sometimes it's okay if the only thing you did today was breathe. Because I think society has an expectation for all of us, and we feel like we need to do something, and we need to get somewhere, and we need to prove something, where sometimes we need to celebrate the little things we did. Like, hey, I showered today. Nailed it, right? Because sometimes, let's be real, that's beyond what we're even feeling like we can do. Or maybe you ate a vegetable and drank all the water that you're supposed to in a day, and celebrate that. Because I don't know about you, but I get like straight up M&Ms for that from my husband. So you have to celebrate where you can, because some days it is really hard to do the basics, to just go from point A to point B. And I think celebrating those little things can actually really help us as we navigate going forward. Okay, I'm going to do this again. I'm going to show you another video. There's this video I saw that really helped me remember what it's like to go through grief when people are trying to help you, and also as you're trying to navigate it. You guys are so patient as I try to tech. All right.
So what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary, everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up. But here's what we tend to do instead. You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them. Or, you know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off. Or, I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture? We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
So because I'm such a visual person, that's part of the reason I really like these videos. Because for me, they say a lot in a little bit, and their illustrations really show us those disconnects. The first one, empathy versus sympathy, there's a hole someone goes into, and someone's looking into the hole saying, "Hey, you down there, you good? You want a sandwich?" And the other person crawls down and stands in that space with them and says, "I don't know what to say, but I'm here for it." The person from above is like, "Hey, don't worry. Like, I know your marriage is terrible, but at least you're married, right?" And it's like, yeah, that's not how that works, right? You need a hug instead of being pointed out that little silver lining, right? And then this one, I think it's true. Most of us often get to the point where we just want people to feel better because we've gone through our process already of it. And so we're like, come on, catch up, catch up, catch up, right? And by doing that, we start alienating each other, right? And I think that visual of them going into that dark hole and how they start building out and out and out. So people get further and further and further apart. And I think that's the interesting thing, right? Is that isolation comes out of grief a lot because we don't want to explain it. We don't know how to explain it. Other people have moved on, but we're still feeling it day in, day out, or randomly. So, as I said, one of the things that we talk about a lot, especially in my world, is self-care versus coping skills. Um, I will be honest, I train on self-care, but I am notoriously terrible at it. But I am awesome at coping skills. And so I like to point out the difference. Self-care is a preventative act, coping is a reactive, right? So one prevents you from burnout or exhaustion or being overwhelmed. And the other one is when you're already overwhelmed or burnt out, you start trying to do. So this is where I joke that I know in theory how to do really great self-care, but I'll tell you, if I work a 15-day straight shift and then I'm like finally a day off and I get home, and then one of my friends is like, "Hey, can you come help me move?" Do I say no? How? I'm like, absolutely, let's go, right? Why? Because for me, I forget that sometimes I need downtime too. Sometimes I'm just as important as the emergency or what's happening in life. Sometimes I need to be disrupted as well from the routine. And sometimes I need to prioritize that, right? So self-care can be anything that could be part of a routine. I'll use my brother as an example again. He's an ultra runner. He does the 100 milers on the mountain ranges here. He loves it. That is insanity to me, right? That is not a good coping skill. I run 2 blocks and I want a snack. Like, it's just not the same thing. He runs 2 hours and he's like, my day I can go on with now. Right. So for him, he prioritizes that. He'll get up at like 3 or 4 in the morning, run his 2 hours, come home as his kids wake up. And that's part of his routine. Not for me. So we have to find the routines that work for us. Whereas coping is the world just feels like it exploded. So how am I going to make it through today? It is not a thriving situation. It is a survival situation. So then my question I ask myself and other people often is, are you more focused on self-care or coping? When it comes to grief and moving through it, most of us don't know how to prevent those feelings. So most of us immediately land in the coping skill zone, right? Because none of us have a good plan or know how it's going to feel to go through loss or grief. If we are healthy people, some of those natural routines, those self-care routines that we already have in place, help us navigate loss and grief and kind of translate into coping skills in a healthy way. But a lot of us don't have those self-care routines in place. And this is where I often remind people the power of routine and self-care and prioritizing the things that really do fill your cup and ground you. And so then the next question is, what are the things that do ground you? Some people, it's religion. Some people, it's family. Some people, it's the ocean. Some people it's art. Some people it's adventuring around the world. Everyone has something different that grounds them. And often I find people saying like, well, I'm not religious, so I guess I'm not grounded. It's like, no, 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 no. If you look throughout society around the world, some of the most grounded people never knew how to articulate what it was that they actually believed in. They just knew what made them feel whole and connected and at peace. And so my encouragement is find the thing that grounds you, the thing that fills your cup, that makes you feel like even on a really bad day, you can navigate it. What is something that you lean into? This question sounds very similar, but I think there is a great reminder of there's natural tendencies of all of us. For me, a really good cup of coffee outside, it's a pretty good day, right? Some people don't like coffee, so that is not a grounding experience for them. But for me, if I'm at the hospital having a really tough day and I grab a cup of coffee and I just stand outside for a couple minutes and I watch chickens run in circles and I watch people acting the fool, I'm like, cool, we're all doing this. All right. And we go back in, right? Why? Because that's something that disrupts the intensity of my work, my life, my everything, and takes me away from it. And so I lean into that. That's a point of reflection, a point of meditation, a point of observation, a point of realizing I'm not the only one existing in this world, right? So what are the things I lean into? What are the things that make me feel grounded and whole and complete? What brings hope when feeling hopeless? This is another one where I encourage people that if you are going through a lot, sometimes we forget what brings us joy and hope. I don't know if you've ever had a really bad day and someone says, what do you want to do? My response is normally, I don't know, right? Because I'm exhausted and angry and feeling hurt and overwhelmed. But the reality is that if we start making notes of the things that bring hope to us or joy, when we're having a really bad day or in a very dark space, it can actually be incredibly powerful to just like open up a journal and say like, ooh, I like listening to records from start to finish the way the artist wanted me to hear it. Why? Because now we just listen to the radio or like a playlist and it's not in the order the artist wanted it. But for me, that's really magical. I'm like, wow, they put that song after that. And I go into this whole existential existence and why they would put that song after it, right? But there's a beauty in figuring out what are those things that bring you hope or awe. And sometimes it's gardening, getting your hands in that dirt and feeling it. Sometimes it's woodworking. Sometimes it's going on a very long walk and reminding yourself that there's more to the world than your life and that more people are trying their best as well, and we're all navigating this together. So how do you bring hope when you're feeling hopeless? And then what are you feeling good about? A lot of us don't know what to feel good about. And I think there's a lot of reflection that come into our lives saying like, here's what I do feel good about. The other day, someone asked me, I was remodeling a section of my house and they're like, do you love it? And I'm like, no. Because it didn't happen how it was in my head, right? And we're still fixing pieces of it. And every time you open a wall or do anything, there's more and more and more behind it, right? So then you get overwhelmed and you get fixated on the problem, but instead of realizing like, oh, how cool it is that I can put this tile on this wall, right? And I feel good about that tile choice. Now, what's behind the wall we're working through, but the tile that I chose is awesome, right? So what am I feeling good about even in those weird situations can help flip the fixation of all the things that are wrong or hurtful or painful to, oh, wow, there are still good things happening in this tough situation without ignoring what's happening in that situation. And then where is an area of growth for you? For me, I think there's so many ways we could look at this. I think most of us, no matter how old we are, how wise we are, or how reflective we are, have more to grow in, right? Times move quick. There's the internet now. There's so much we can learn. You guys signed up for mini med school on a random Saturday. So obviously you're curious people, right? So where are areas that we can grow as an individual, as a partnership, as a community? How do we not get stuck in that rhythm that is stagnant versus how do we work with each other to build more and more light and goodness in the communities that we're in our home, in the interactions we have? So sometimes that's as much as saying, instead of responding to everything with no right away, saying, let me think about that. Because maybe in 5 minutes, it won't be no anymore, right? Maybe it will, but at least you thought about it, right? Because a lot of us just go with our information right away. So where it's an area of growth for you, where is an area you want to become better at? One of the areas I tend to work on, sometimes it's, sometimes I'm a fidgety person. So what do I do with my hands? Sometimes it's, hey, I need to ask more intentional questions. Instead of, how are you today? As I walk down the hallway, saying, like I see someone, I say, hey, how are you today? And then I keep walking, right? I don't know if you guys have done this. And then I'm like, I wonder how often people start answering and I'm just all the way down the hallway, right? Because that's a greeting now. It's not an actual intentional question. So how do I ask questions better and actually mean them versus the nonchalant, what's up? No time for a response. How are you doing? No time for a response. And I will tell you, one time someone said, how are you doing? And they kept walking. And I decided to make drama and was like, I'll tell you. And they were mid-step and they went, oh, because they were not prepared for that, right? Because as a society, we don't tend to be intentional about a lot of things, unfortunately. And I know that's generalizing, but there is something to be said about how do we ask those questions and actually want to hear the answer. When someone says, if you say, I want to be better at this, do you actually want to be better at it? Or are you just saying it so that way someone feels better about themselves, right? Or if you're in a partnership or in a friendship and they say, I never feel like I'm the priority, or you're always so busy, do you say, I'll work on that? Or do you say, what would it look like in your mind for me to be more intentional? Right? Because sometimes we just need to hear what other people are thinking so we can get more curious and more information and grow. So where is an area of growth for you? And then this is one of the things I like to just reflect on. Grief is the last act of love we have to give to those we loved. Where there is deep grief, there was great love. And often I think about this and we think of grief as the end of the story, where I actually think of grief as the way to celebrate the memories, the people, the things that are going around the world. Because the truth is, history, society, everything is built on people, on community, on loss, on nature, all of these things bundled into one. And I think there's an incredible power in leaning into that love is a thing that probably we were honored and special enough to be part of. And when I think about grief and coping with it, in some of my grief groups, people often say, why do people say such dumb things, right? I don't know if you guys have ever gone through grief and someone says something absolutely ridiculous to you, right? And you sit there and you have no idea how to respond. Because the first thought is, you're an idiot. The second thought is, should I even be talking to you, right? And then your third thought is I'm just going to walk away from this, right? Because often people don't know what it's like to be you, right? And they don't know what your love looks like or your grief feels like or what you're navigating. And sometimes they don't even know it when it happens to them because they had a different relationship. They had a different way of thinking about things. But for me, I like to, even when people say ridiculous things, when people say things I don't agree with or can't understand how they got there, I like to remind myself that grief is the last act of love we have to give those we loved. So how do I celebrate them going forward? How do I react for them? How do I make sure that their story goes on and the beauty of their lives plays out? And I'll say, I work in grief a lot. I've done a lot of funerals, which is a weird thing to say. But one of my favorite parts about funerals and about my job is I get to know people I never met. And I've often said I'm a time traveler in my job. And it's because when someone's going through a really hard time in the hospital, I get to jump into that space with the family and the best friends of that person and hear all the weirdest and best parts of that person, right? And I still remember there was one guy I met and he was obsessed with recycling and riding his bike. And I learned so much about recycling and what actually happens and all this stuff because his 10-year-old daughter knew all of it. And all she said was, more people need to recycle. More people need to recycle. Daddy wants more people to recycle. And I was like, okay, we're on a recycling kick. So I made sure the ICU had recycling down by the time they left, right? Because I just wanted to make sure that little girl knew that the things that were important to her dad were important to other people too. and that her voice mattered. And she got to give a little presentation that her dad had given her to the staff so everyone knew all about it. And sometimes we just need permission to have that voice. Sometimes we need permission to hear those stories and navigate with people. And sometimes if we ask enough questions and sit with people as they navigate grief, sometimes it's messy, but also, man, you learn a lot of really cool and amazing things about people. Maybe they had a weird hobby. Maybe they had a weird saying that just makes absolute sense with you, whatever it may be. And I think that's how we get to celebrate people. We get to celebrate love. We get to celebrate what was, and we take all those pieces of the past and we grow on them, right? And so the last act of love we have to give those we loved. Where there is deep grief, there was great love. All right. So I did put in here my email address. If you guys ever have questions or opinions, you can go ahead and email me or give me a call. But often there's a lot of questions actually on grief and coping skills and all these things. So I do want to make sure that we have time for that. So feel free to ask whatever you want or can.
Sara-May, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. This is a very sensitive topic, but important to all of us as humans. There are several comments in the chat. They're enjoying your talk and they love the videos. So just wanted to let you know that. Someone in the audience said, working through the grieving process has certainly been a profound learning experience. What surprised her was which individuals who are lost can bring it on. She's thinking specifically about a friend who only came to Hawaii occasionally. They didn't spend much time together or communicate when she was not here. She knew she was ill, yet when she learned she had died, the response was so profound. Any thoughts about that?
You know, this is an endless topic, right? But you think about it, when a celebrity dies or when someone you knew or looked up to dies, there's a weird part of your day that is just absolutely disrupted, right? And especially even if it's not someone that you're incredibly close to, sometimes you grieve the relationship you didn't have enough of. You knew you really loved them, you knew you enjoyed your time with them, and you wished you had been more intentional with them. So there's grief in that and the loss of what could have been, but there's also grief in like the secondary response of it, right? And I think I talked about that, primary grief and secondary grief. Secondary grief can be overwhelming. And there's people, I just had a friend from college pass away a couple weeks ago, and we were friends in college, but I haven't seen them in, I don't know, 20 years. And I was like, oh man, that hit way harder than I anticipated because I looked up to them so much. And the moments I did have with them were so bright and beautiful that I couldn't help reflect on all the things that maybe I missed out on, and maybe I should have been more intentional about. Maybe I should have asked more questions. And so that disconnect can make you feel a lot of grief. So it might be remorse, and it also just might be you didn't realize how much that person meant to you and your life until they were gone.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience here?
Hi. Your slide about self-care, as you were going through that, I was thinking, what are you feeling good about? Where is an area of growth for you? It's kind of like you're asking us to look at the silver lining for ourselves. So back to the issue of witnessing somebody else's grief. You know, I understand and appreciate witnessing. Is there a strategy where you can move from witnessing to encouraging their self-care?
Thank you. I actually normally say something about this because silver linings can actually be incredibly powerful as well. I guess where I stray away from using silver linings is if you're not in the right space. So if someone's just now going through something, it may not be the time to say, like, at the funeral, like, you're young, you can get married again, or, you know, it's okay, you could probably adopt a kid, you know, like those are things that are not the right time, right? But if it's a close friend or someone you've been navigating life with and you're like, okay, we're due for a pep talk, sometimes perspective can be really good, right? Which is same for ourselves. Sometimes we have to give ourselves that permission to be in a dark space and grieve and sit with it in whatever version of it needs to be. And then sometimes we need to stand up and go outside, right? And sometimes we need to do a little bit more than just shower, because for some days we need to be pulled out of that. But I think it's being sensitive and knowing your relationship that's really important, because the reflection part can actually energize people and like how to do things better that works for them. So maybe not saying like, you're young, you can have another kid. You could say something like, what is it that you think would fill your cup going forward? You know? And so you could figure out different ways of saying it. I'll be honest with some of my friends, they're like Debbie Downers. And I'm like, all right, we're going to have a pep talk right now. We're going to go outside. We're going to walk the block. We're going to do this. And then we're going to celebrate something stupid. Let's go. Why? Because sometimes you need to just yank people out of their comfort zone. But those are my best friends. Those aren't people I just met or have a disconnected relationship with. So I think there is a version of close friendships versus disconnected, and also making sure you ask the question of, where are you at? What do you want? Because maybe they don't want the same thing as you do. Does that answer your question? Okay.
There's a comment from somebody online. They cannot remember where this quote came from, but they said, grief is just love with no place to go.
I love that quote. I've actually heard that before. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
I think I really appreciate this session, because one of the reasons why I joined this program is I lost my dad last year, and from cancer. And I think I went through the stages of grief that you were talking about, and I won't say I'm over that. And I think there was no greater, the most painful feeling I've ever felt was losing a parent. And I'm still caring for my mom. My mom is in San Diego, and she's going through that grief on a different level than I am. And being away from her, I wanted to ask you, do you have any recommendations or any tools that I can use to be able to support my mom? Because like what you said, I want her to get over that feeling, but grief in itself is different for different people. And being away from her is very difficult for me. And so any suggestions or recommendations that you could provide to get through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so sorry to hear about that. Navigating people loss is, I mean, I wish there was a perfect answer, but I kind of look at it as sometimes, especially when it goes to other people or even ourselves, sometimes we try to band-aid our emotions or our grief. And I'll use a very real example of this week. I was wrestling with my nieces, and I bonked my nose and scraped the tip of my nose. And I put a Band-Aid on it because I was like, this will do. And then when I went to take the Band-Aid off, what happened? You rip the scab off with it, right? And then it bled again. And so then I put another Band-Aid on it, and it stopped bleeding, and then I ripped it off again. And I think sometimes we think the Band-Aid method is the right way of just kind of ignoring what's going on. Like, I'm not going to deal with the real issue. I'm just going to cover it up and let it do its thing and heal. But at some point, the Band-Aid has to come off, right? And so I think there is a lot of beauty in going through it, feeling all the things. They don't have to happen all at the same time. Sometimes you can completely put on a movie and tune out, right? But supporting a parent, supporting a friend, supporting a partner can be really challenging. My big thing is that I think most people just want to talk about it. They want to share the stories of their loved ones, remember the best times, sometimes remember the worst times, right? Because I think the thing that people fear the most is that their story will not be told, that people won't remember them going forward. Their legacy will stop. And I think one of the biggest challenges for partners is, how do I keep that legacy going so other people know how incredible my partner was, And from a mother to a son, maybe saying like, what do you think dad would do in this situation? Gives her permission to hypothesize about, oh man, he wasn't good at emotions or whatever it would be. And he's probably just go to the wood shop and like out there and cut things for 10 minutes and then come back in and be like, I don't know, what do you think? It could be any variation, but it gives her that voice and that permission to share stories and how she thinks they would solve problems or navigate things. And it gives you the opportunity to learn more about your dad that maybe you didn't know before. Right. And so I think that's narrative, that's storytelling. And if you look at society, that's how we've done it, right? We've always told stories. Stories is a super thing, right? That's how all the history books were written, how everything was passed down in every single culture was the power of story. So I say, let the story go on, ask the questions, hear the stories, invite people into the stories. When you hear a really good one, say, hey, you know who would love to hear that? And then have her tell it again, because that gives her freedom and her voice to celebrate and love and pass on that narrative.
Someone had a comment. I found that some people hesitate to join support groups, but they have always found them very helpful. Could you tell us about support groups that may be available here?
Yeah, absolutely. So support groups are super interesting. I thought I would hate them, to be honest, and I run them. So go figure, that's a weird thing. But support groups can be anything for different people. There's a variation of support groups. Some are more like a 6-week program where you touch on different topics for 6 weeks, and that's the program. My personal support groups, so the ones that I lead, are all story-based because, as you said, for me, I think story is the most powerful. And sometimes I'm actually having a good day when I'm going through grief group, right? So do I need to be in a dark space all the time? Or if I'm having a good day, can I have a good day? So some of my support groups, we dig deep some days and it's really intense. And really, everyone's in tears and everyone's reflecting and we're just gutting through it. And then other days we're talking about great places to eat, coping food, the thing that you ordered from New York for some strange reason, whatever it may be. And that helps disrupt that. So support groups can kind of be in any direction. If you go online ever, kakuamau.org, they deal with serious illness conversation, but actually on their website, they have a link for the Bereavement Network of Hawaii, and it's most of the grief groups on all islands are listed on there, and they have different focuses. So some are like child loss, partner loss, suicide loss, whatever it may be, and you can get a specialized group for that conversation. And then, of course, there's a ton of virtual ones for the mainland. So I really encourage you, if you have questions, you can email me, but also being mindful that each group is slightly different. And if it doesn't work for you, don't go to it. I think we feel guilt in letting people down, but I think there is something to be said about find the group that works for you, a community that works for you. And when it's no longer filling your cup, don't do it.
Who are your support groups open to?
My support groups are open to anyone. Mine are free and they're open to anyone. Because I work at a hospital, I was fortunate enough not to have to charge and not to have any stringent responsibilities for it because we're a community place. Some people work for specific companies or like hospice, so it's only for hospice patients, whatever it may be. So each group has a little bit of a variation. So actually on that bereavement network list, if you go underneath, it says eligibility and it also says cost. Mine is absolutely free. We have 2 that are virtual and 2 that are in person a month.
There's a question here. What would be better for those who acknowledge death and catastrophic events, either on TV or in public, then our hearts go out to you? Is that the best that can be said?
Okay, this is one of those I need to start writing down my answers because there was one day I had a really good one and I still can't remember it. But I think a lot of times, we run out of things to say, which is why we often say thinking of you, right? Because we don't know what else to say after that. I think just acknowledging that it's tough is healing, right? I think often we try to, this is going back to our silver lining thing. We're like thinking of you, sending love, which can be really powerful, but acknowledging this is a really tough time. I send strength as you navigate it, or something specific that empowers them and supports them and acknowledges the serious intensity of the situation. Because I think there's been times someone said thinking of you and I'm like, what are you thinking about? Right? Because I don't know if you know what I'm thinking, right? Or what I'm going through. So giving them a clarity and like, I'm sending strength your way, or please know that if there's anything I can do to support you, I'm here for it. Any of it, those types of things can be really helpful.
There's a question online about gender differences towards grief. I've found that many men who do not want to admit their grief for maybe a potential fatal disease may hesitate to join support groups. Are there any discrepancies in gender approach towards grief?
I think there are discrepancies, but not because one is better than the other. I think often we've not empowered people to feel the emotions that they feel. In some cultures, in some societies, in some homes, there is a gender role. Some of that has been disrupted. Sometimes it's not in your home, but sometimes there is a gender role where one is supposed to be strong and make things happen, and one's allowed to fall apart. And so I think often it does come down to that as the societal pressure of what they think is expected of them. But that's where instead of having, so we'll use this example of men versus women. Often men aren't sure if they're allowed to fall apart in public. Some are completely comfortable with it, but a lot of them are like, what does that mean? What does that look like? I don't really want to cry in front of people. I don't know if I even want to say anything in front of people, right? And different people have different coping skills. My dad is very talkative. He would love to share a story. My brother, if you put him in a coping group or a support group, he would just sit there and be like, why do I have to hear everyone's sad story? Because for him, that's not how he's processing it. He processes everything up here, where my dad is Latin and processes it externally, right? So yes, there is often a gender thing that people observe, but I do think it is by person, it is by culture, it is by age, it is by society. There are so many factors to it. And I'll be honest, there was a point where I had 9 men and 1 girl in my support group. And I was like, well, this is weird and I love it, right? Because I have no idea how that happened because that had never happened before. So I do think there is a disruptive possibility of it, but I do think out of the norm in certain cultures, the men are taught that they can't have those emotions outside.
I've thought that surviving or working through grief and growing is a result of resilience. I noticed on your slide, it was a binomial choice between self-care and coping. It seems to me resilience is a combination of the two, and resilience is the activation of hope and action. So maybe you could comment about the binomial choice that your slide presented, and what is resilience to you?
I love that you asked that. I remember I had a really intense situation in my life, and I go to therapy. Yay. And my therapist said, you're so resilient. And I was like, why, thank you. Thinking badge of honor, nailing it, going through life, so strong, so resilient. And then they said, I'm really sorry that you've had to become so resilient. And that floored me. I reflected on that for months. Why? Because I think resiliency is epic and it is strong and it keeps moving us forward. But it is the worst that we need resiliency in life, right? Because if we didn't have to be resilient, we could be free. And that's where a lot of people say that like kids are so free, right? Because they haven't had to be resilient yet. They've been able to play and laugh and feel when they're angry and feel when they're sad and feel when they're happy. But as we grow up and as we become adults and age, we're taught resiliency is strength. And that's our survivor mentality. Well, I'm really resilient, so I can make it through that. But my goal in life is not, after that therapy session, my goal shifted from being really good at resilience to how do I live well and not in that survival zone, right? Because I agree with you, resiliency is amazing, but I am working really hard. I'm not saying I'm resilient, done, check that box. And saying like, oh man, okay, so how do I do this healthily? How do I use my grief and my sadness and my disruption to good instead of putting it in survive that box, right? And so that's kind of the pivotal point for me and why I don't use that as the best coping skill, right?
Do we have any last questions from this audience? Sara-May, many of the folks really liked your videos, the 2 videos that you showed. Would it be all right if we sent those links to them?
Absolutely.
So Chang, maybe we could send the links to the 2 videos to everybody in the emails. So I love them too, by the way. I thought they were really wonderful.
Yeah. And I will say there's a lot of really great grief videos. And if you have to talk to people, sometimes like if someone in your life has lost a loved one, or maybe your grandkid or your cousin or something, and you don't know what to say, sometimes videos are the perfect thing because you don't have to say anything, right? You can just debrief it with them afterwards.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate
Thank
you.
you.